Of all the barbarian successor states in Western Europe, the Franks were the most impactful. Their influence on the European Middle Ages, both culturally and politically, cannot be understated. But it wasn't always clear that would be the case. When the last Western Roman emperor was deposed, the Goths, Vandals, and Burgundians were all better suited to emerge as the new powerhouse in the West. But the Franks quickly came into their own, and soon found themselves in a position to challenge the Eastern Empire for influence over the Western world. By the mid-500s, one Frank in particular, Theudebert, was becoming a thorn in Justinian's side. He did this by asserting his own influence over his realm, and by refusing to accept Constantinople's sole authority over Western Europe. When we think of the fall of the Western Roman Empire, we tend to think of it like the destruction of the Death Star. Centralized authority fell, and all the satellite powers were instantly free, able to govern themselves and individual cultural entities. But it wasn't really like that. When Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus in 476, Western Europe still considered itself Roman. The empire cast a long shadow, and the new barbarian kingdoms that now ruled all drew some connection back to it. Some of this was cultural, such as the Visigoths, who adopted Roman legal principles and administration, and still used Latin for official purposes. Some of it was familial, as was the case with the king of Burgundy, Dudabald, who was the nephew of Ricimer. Yes, that Ricimer. And some of it was political, particularly in Italy, where, after deposing Romulus Augustulus, Odoacer sent the imperial regalia to Emperor Zeno in Constantinople and pledged to rule Italy in the Eastern Emperor's name, almost as a client king. And when Theodoric and his Ostrogoths replaced Odoacer in 493, they did so at Zeno's behest. Western Europe may have been ruled by barbarians, but it was still very much Roman. While the major players were vying to be the heirs of Rome, the Franks in 476 were, well, just kind of there. Sure, there was a Roman influence. That was simply inescapable. But at the time, the Franks weren't major players. There was no need to emulate Rome if you weren't in a position to actually replace Rome. And at the time, the Franks were not in a position to replace Rome. If you were alive in 476 and could take bets on who would emerge as the strongest power in Western Europe by the middle of the 6th century, no one, and I mean no one, would put money on the Franks. During the final years of the Western Roman Empire, Frankish power was scattered among various factions. And after 476, they controlled very little land. According to legend, the Franks who lived around here, the so-called Salian Franks, were led in the mid-400s by a king named Merovech. Our surviving records of him are pretty spotty, and it's even been suggested that he was purely a mythical figure. I would not go that far personally, but he exists in that gray area between real history and legend. Merovech's descendants, though, would bring the Franks to prominence. His son, Childeric, led the Salian Franks at the time of Odoacer's conquest of Italy, but died shortly after. Childeric's son, Clovis, ascended to power upon his father's death. And Clovis is where the Franks start to gain notoriety. After assuming his throne, Clovis pushed south and united the other Frankish clans under his umbrella, becoming the first ruler of a united Frankish kingdom, starting the Merovingian dynasty, named for his grandfather Merovech. By the way, a quick, but I think interesting side note. This is a portrait of Clovis, and this is a portrait of Louis XVI. These two men share a significant trait. Do you know what it is? Here's a hint. And another one. Can you see it now? That's right, these men share a name. Over time, the name Clovis became Louis, or Louis in French. And it's actually connected to the German name Ludwig and the Italian name Luigi. So that's fun. Anyway, back to the 5th century. Clovis not only became the first king of a united Frankish kingdom, but he also significantly expanded Frankish territorial control. One of his most significant victories was the Battle of Toliac, where he defeated the Alemanni, and this comes with a very familiar story as told by Gregory of Tours in the History of the Franks. Clovis's army was on the verge of defeat when, out of desperation, the till this point pagan king cried out to the god of his wife Clotilda, who was a Christian. Quote, Jesus Christ, whom Clotilda asserts to be the Son of the living God, who art said to give aid to those in distress, and to bestow victory on those who hope in thee. I beseech the glory of thy aid, with the vow that if thou wilt grant me victory over these enemies, and I shall know that power which she says that people dedicated in thy name have had from thee, I will believe in thee and be baptized in thy name. Unquote. After this plea, the tide of the battle turned. Clovis was victorious, and then kept his word and converted to Christianity. This sounds very similar to another famous conversion story. It is basically what happened to Constantine, but with minor differences. Constantine was an important figure who unified the empire after a battlefield conversion to Christianity. Clovis was also an important figure who unified his kingdom after a battlefield conversion to Christianity. Gregory comes right out with it too, calling Clovis, quote, another Constantine, unquote. This isn't meant to be subtle. He is saying that Clovis, a now powerful king in Gaul, inherited Constantine's legacy. This story speaks to the blossoming Romanitas of the Franks. As they rose to prominence, they joined their brethren in the West who found ways to connect their kingdom to the Roman Empire. It adds legitimacy to Frankish rule, both through continuity and through the approval of the divine. God chose Rome, God chose Constantine, God chose Clovis. There is a lot of interesting research around Clovis and this battle in particular, but this is Byztory, not Frankstory, so I'm not going to get too deep into the weeds here. But someone should do Frankstory, because that would be fun. Following his conversion, Clovis ruled the Franks until his death in 511. His lands were then split among his sons, Theudebert, Clodomir, Theudebert, and Clothar. This was pretty much always a problem during the Merovingian period. A king would die, the kingdom would be split, and the various claimants would fight over territory. But the individual kings generally viewed their co-kings as equals who ruled over a portion of the kingdom as a whole. The Franks mostly viewed this entire thing as the Frankish kingdom, but each of these as their own sub-kingdom. The realms occasionally worked together, with a notable example being their war on Burgundy in 524, in which Clodomir was killed. The Burgundian kingdom was eventually incorporated into the Frankish kingdom in 534. And also during the early years of the Gothic War, when Justinian reached out to the Franks in the hopes of forming an alliance, he didn't just address one king, he addressed each of them as a collective, as parts of the whole. When the Franks did get involved in the Gothic War, though, it wasn't as a unified, cohesive unit. It was mostly the Austrasian Franks who bordered Italy and hoped to extend their own borders. Austrasia, which included Reims and Metz, was ruled by Theudebert following Clovis's death. He ruled until his own death in 534, and his kingdom then passed to his son Theudebert, who would take steps to further legitimize Frankish power in Europe. Theudebert is often viewed as a strong leader, one of the better kings of the era. The Roman historian Agathias described him as, quote, exceedingly daring and wild, and inordinately fond of taking unnecessary risks, unquote. One of those unnecessary risks was his invasion of Italy during the Gothic War, which I've talked about in previous videos. Theudebert didn't side with the Romans or the Ostrogoths. He was in it solely for himself, hoping for territorial gains, though his overall gains in Italy were minimal. But the battlefield wasn't the only arena where he tangled with the Eastern Romans. Theudebert was the first Frankish king to really assert his independence from Constantinople. The first to present his kingdom as something that wasn't subservient to the Eastern Empire. The best example of this is coinage. Before Theudebert, Frankish kings minted their likeness on silver coins, never on gold coins. Gold was reserved for the emperor in Constantinople, a sign of deference. Theudebert changed this, and here's an example. This is a gold coin minted with Theudebert's likeness, to the extent that you can call this anyone's likeness. This is Theudebert, and the text reads DN Theudebertus. The DN stands for Dominus Noster, which translates to Our Lord, or Our Master. So it's meant to read Our Master Theudebert, a common way to refer to kings. The back reads Victoria Augustorum, meaning Victory of the Emperors. And this down here is CONOB, short for Constantinople Obrizum, or Constantinople Pure Gold. That might seem interesting, because this was a Frankish coin, not a coin minted in Constantinople. But what Theudebert was doing here was using Roman branding to emphasize his own legitimacy. Here is a Roman coin depicting Justinian and Justin, who were co-emperors in 527. On the front we have the same DN, Justin and Justinian, and on the back we have the same inscription as we see on Theudebert's coin. This could be seen as a practical action. Money looked like this, so why change it? Consistency is a good thing. But there's more to it than that. Theudebert wasn't just minting a gold coin in his likeness. He was striking a claim to legitimacy. He was emphasizing that he wasn't a client of the Roman emperor, he was an equal to the Roman emperor. This might seem elementary to us in the 21st century, but it was a big deal in the 6th century. The emperor in Constantinople had some sort of primacy, and Theudebert was putting himself up at that level. Procopius laments this decision, demonstrating just how much the Eastern Empire was irked by these barbarians in the West stepping into their own. At this point in time, Justinian, like his predecessors, still referred to himself in official edicts as the leader of the Franks, Alemanni, Gepids, and Lombards, despite not directly controlling those people. In Justinian's mind, the Franks ruled Gaul only because he permitted them to rule Gaul. Theudebert took this as a, quote, personal insult, unquote, according to Agathias, and assumed that the other kingdoms on the empire's periphery would feel the same way. He ruled in his own right, he felt, not because Justinian gave him permission. And surely everyone else felt the same. He sent delegations to his neighbors and hoped to build a massive force that could move into Thrace and show the emperor who really ran the show. This planned invasion never materialized, though, and may have been mostly saber-rattling. The barbarian kingdoms around this time sensed Roman weakness, particularly with Totila's resurgence during the Gothic War, having recaptured most of Italy in the mid-540s. Everyone was ready to pounce and assert their own authority over their own realms, independent of Constantinople's influence. They weren't quite strong enough to launch an invasion of the Eastern Empire, but they were trying to expand their own realms. In a surviving letter to Justinian, Theudebert states that his kingdom extended from Pannonia to the sea, encompassing a vast stretch of European land. These claims were exaggerated, but was it really more exaggerated than Justinian's claims of authority over the Franks, Alemanni, Gepids, and Lombards? Again, Theudebert is basically acting like a Roman emperor here, or at least what his contemporaneous Roman emperor acted like. This, though, earned him a bit of a nasty reputation in Justinian's court. So much so that when he died in the late 540s, his son, Dudabald, wrote a letter to Justinian defending his father and mentioning how displeased he was with Justinian's apparent vilification of his father. We sadly don't have the full context of what Theudebald is referring to here, but he fully supports his father in the letter and defends him against various alleged infractions. And there's an additional interesting point made by historian Andrew Gillett in relation to this letter. Theudebald's letter survives in a collection of 48 Frankish letters from the 6th century. Immediately following it are two earlier letters from Theudebert to Justinian, in which Theudebert broadly praises Justinian and speaks to him with some respect. Since Theudebald's letter was written shortly after Theudebert's death, it's clear that these letters are presented out of chronological order. Gillett argues that the two Theudebert letters may have been retranscribed and resent to Justinian along with Theudebald's letter as evidence of the late king's overall respect for the emperor. This would make the whole packet a 6th century per my last email, sent by a Frankish king to Justinian the Great, intended to remind him of the goodwill between the states and to somewhat smooth over the tensions that had arisen between them. I kind of like this argument, even though it is hard to prove definitively. It does, though, reflect a broader trend in Frankish political self-perception. Theudebald is chastising Justinian here, while at the same time speaking of his father's respect for the emperor. He writes not as a subordinate client, but as an equal. That this dynamic had emerged over the course of just a few decades shows how quickly the Merovingian relations with the Eastern Roman Empire evolved. Before Clovis, the Franks weren't major players. During Clovis's reign, they were finding legitimacy. Clovis's grandson would take it even further, by staking himself as Justinian's equal. That's a huge step in only a few generations, and one that few people and few leaders would be capable of making. Historian Patrick Geary wrote that, quote, Theudebert was no simple barbarian king seeking plunder. With his Roman advisors to educate him, he probably intended to accomplish what other Gallic pretenders had wanted for centuries: to use the West as a base for the conquest of the imperial throne. Unquote. And while Theudebert did fall short of this, his ambition really helped to lay the foundation for the future of the Franks in Western Europe. Make no mistake, Theudebert stood on Clovis's shoulders. Without Clovis, Theudebert would not have had a kingdom to rule. Clovis established the Franks as a military power. Theudebert made them a political power. Where Clovis won lands, Theudebert won minds. No emperor in Constantinople ever looked to the west and saw Clovis as a threat. They only saw him as a client. The emperor, after all, still viewed himself as the ruler of the Franks. But Theudebert changed that. For the first time, Constantinople had to take a Frankish king seriously, not as a client, but as an equal, or even potentially as a threat. That's Theudebert's legacy. Not only a strong king, but a credible challenger to the imperial order. It is here that the Franks begin to look less like a barbarian kingdom and more like the future rulers of Western Europe.